Making real progress in supply chain sustainability. I'm joined today by Heidi Buckout. She is Manager of Sustainability with Guidehouse. Hi Heidi.
Hi.
Thanks for being with me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Tell me a little bit about Guidehouse.
Absolutely. So Guidehouse is an international consulting firm. We have a variety of different projects and we have a really large sustainability aspect globally.
Okay, so totally on point with what we want to talk about today, but more specifically, let's talk about the practice of greenwashing.
Okay.
Is it a problem today? And if so, getting worse, getting better? How widespread? Just what's going on in that area?
Absolutely. So actually, greenwashing is interesting because, in my opinion, I think it's getting better, and here's why. A lot of companies have been called out for greenwashing, which basically is talking about your sustainability plan, but not actually doing something or even lying about it. So in this way, it's getting better because now people are starting to call out brands for doing that, brands and companies. So when we talk about greenwashing, as far as, commercial brands or something like that, people have been encouraged to tell their story, their sustainability story or their carbon emissions reduction story or their net zero story. And so they want to go really big. The problem is they're not really doing anything. So now people are noticing it and they're saying, sorry, we don't believe you. And they're getting called out. And in fact, some companies are now getting legally called out. So people are afraid now to talk about what they're doing in sustainability and emissions reduction.
I could see why, but greenwashing takes different forms. You seem to be suggesting sometimes it's unintentional.
Right.
Sometimes you want to put out a statement and you really want to make progress, but it just dies somewhere, and sometimes you say it's out and out deceit.
Right.
So is it a little of both? I mean, which one is more prevalent as a practice?
Well, I think greenwashing was more prevalent, but now what we're facing is greenhushing, where now people are like, oh no, I don't want to get greenwashed, so we're not going to talk about anything. So what we're trying to recommend is a middle ground, where you talk about your sustainability journey, but you're honest with it, because you don't want to be telling some story that never happens and people call you out for it, but you don't want to be saying nothing. So we're trying to find that balance, and it's hard because people want to do things and people want to engage with companies and brands that are doing things. So there's really a balance of authenticity.
The assumption here is that, let's say on the customer side, on the user side, is that there's more of an awareness of sustainability in general.
Yeah.
Do in fact customers care about whether the companies that they purchase from are sustainable, are truly green?
In my experience, yes. I think people care about where their products are made and who are making them. I don't have any statistics to match that though, but just working on companies that have a pretty extensive supply chain, people are now starting to notice it. And I will say a lot of it has to do with access on the internet. You can look at a product and know where it came from and who's working on it and the pieces of materials that have been put into it. So I do think people care. The problem is they don't know what to do with that. So it really is an onus on the companies and the brands to say, hey, here's what we're doing with it. Even if they're not quite sustainable yet, they can talk about where they're going, what they see, and what they hope to do in the future.
Do you see more and more companies actually making green and sustainability part of the brand as opposed to just being like an incidental thing that they do?
I think so. I think that they're being smart about it because, again, we don't want to get into the greenwashing, so they're being honest with what they're doing. They're saying, hey, we see this as a problem and we're going to do something about it. If there's a company that's not talking about it, then they're probably not doing anything. We're seeing now companies being called to action of not just putting out a sustainability report, but making it interesting and making it part of their brand. So it needs to be part of their story. People care about the origin of things. And yes, we still like things fast and easy. So it's also a balance on the consumers to be aware of what they're buying. So I think it depends on the consumer, but it also depends on the company. And we can be conscious consumers if we choose. There's enough out there where we can decide to purchase in a sustainable way.
So pressure from the consumer side, but also inaction is no longer a luxury you can afford because of what's happening on the regulatory side. Tell me more about that.
That's a really good point. So right now we're seeing a lot of US-based regulation and global regulation. So we have a new set of SEC regulations that have just come out that include mandatory regulations on submitting your carbon emissions in scope 1 and 2. So those are really important. Scope 3 are the emissions in the supply chain, We're not, those aren't regulated yet, but we're getting there. So my recommendation would be companies should be paying attention to all of it, right? But I do think as far as reporting on these things, the more that these regulations come out, the more consumers will be aware of it. And so it's kind of a cycle, right? People are seeing that companies are responding to these regulations, and companies are now having to do it. So they can't just be silent anymore. If they're not doing anything, people are going to ask why, and so are the regulators. And it's going to go all the way across the supply chain globally.
And the fact that the SEC decided at this time not to worry about so-called Scope 3 emissions over which a company has no direct control, that's not grounds for breathing a sigh of relief and saying, we don't have to do anything because the SEC doesn't really care.
They don't, I wouldn't say nobody cares about the supply chain. Supply chain is essential to this. They're just not ready to mandate it because the supply chain is so complicated. Besides it being Scope 3, there are 15 different categories that people need to report on within Scope 3.
Oh my goodness.
And the GHG protocol, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, has created these categories. So companies really need to pick apart what they're doing and how they're working their suppliers to be able to report that. So I think the SEC will get there. So we need to just be ready to talk about those things. And again, how do you make that story authentic?
Tell me more about that. Let's dive a little bit deeper. What are some of the things that a company needs to cover in order to effectively convey its sustainability story?
I said it a couple of times in this interview, but I would say authenticity is important. What I have found is it's not just like, hey, we're a company, we're selling you this, you should buy it. It's talking about the people that use it and the people that make it. Testimonials, real stories about the suppliers and the people that care about these companies. That's what makes it real. So we want to connect in general with humans. We also want to connect with what we're doing and feel like it's purposeful. So people are really looking at testimonials. They're really looking at company stories. So we do a lot of stories about the companies we work with, how our work in sustainability has positively impacted them and what they're working on. And same with supply chain. Like, if you think about the beginning of the supply chain in the upstream, we're working with farmers, we're working with seamstresses, we're working with people who are making ingredients. Those people are interesting. Those are small businesses that roll up to big companies, and they have a really big impact. So we like to tell those stories.
You got to tell that story to the investor community as well, do you not?
That's right, And that's another thing. I think people are sort of moving away from using sustainability and ESG as the same thing. Investors are still talking about ESG. The products and brands are still talking about sustainability, and they do cross over. ESG won't go away, but it won't be in the same conversation every time. But investors are always going to be wondering if it's a profitable solution, and it can be.
Well, it's good to know that action is being taken, and maybe greenwashing is on the wane. We can only hope so. But thank you, Heidi, for this advice on how a company can avoid falling into that trap.
Absolutely.
I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great to meet you.
I've been speaking with Heidi Buckout of Guidehouse. Thank you very much for watching.